I am Max Clark. This is part 2 of what's turned into a rant on SD-WAN, SSE, and SASE. Part 1, really kind of history, networks, SD-WAN, how we got from point A to point B. And now we're going to talk about SSE and we're going to talk about SASE. Or I'm going to talk about SSE and SASE because there's only one of me. First off, what the heck is SSE and SASE? SSE, Secure Service Edge, is this idea of encapsulating and moving your security functions from, these like old school appliance, big iron, antiquated things into, we'll just say, the cloud delivered applications. And that usually encompasses secure web gateway. That'll encompass a secure remote access or ZTNA. It'll include a CASB, cloud access service broker. And then usually you'll see most SSE infrastructure will be firewall as a service. Depending on the SSE provider, these things change a little bit up and down and what they're actually giving you. And what's missing from SSE, and this goes back to SD-WAN, is the A piece, so access. So SASE is SSE plus access, and access is SD-WAN. So we had SSE, and then somebody said, oh, hey, wait a minute. Why don't we just shove the entire network security function together into this one thing, and we're going to call it SASE. And that's how we got SASE. And by the way, I'm not going to knock either SSE or SASE because I love them both. And you're probably not going to buy SSE. You're probably going to jump all the way into SASE. There are vendors where you have on-premise firewalls are going to try to sell you their roadmap into SASE. What they're really selling you is like an SSE overlay on top of your existing infrastructure because they want you to still spend gobs and gobs of money on what you have at your office. But we're just going to talk about making the jump all the way into SASE land. The frustrating thing about SASE for me is most of the OEM firewall manufacturers want to have to give a SASE roadmap because they know the entire market is moving there. But while they're giving you a SASE roadmap, they still want you to invest and use their existing SKUs and spend money on their hardware and their renewals. And this is the innovator's dilemma, right? Because they've got revenue and they've got business that they can't blow up instantaneously, and they need to preserve it while also protecting the future from upstarts. And there are a lot of upstarts that are pure SASE players. The thing that's incredible about SASE, if you haven't experienced it before, and by the way, also with SASE, with SSE, you see vendors that are SSE. What's a good example? Big ones. Zscaler, right? So Zscaler does not sell you a SD-WAN solution. Cloudflare will use SASE in marketing, but they're not selling you the SD-WAN component. They're going to sell you something called Magic WAN, which is software running inside of your network that still has to transit through, hopefully, an SD-WAN for circuit selection. So these are SSE infrastructure, where you still have to have some sort of SD-WAN running on your premise, and you have to have something providing. Really what most firewalls are doing for you is providing a NAT traversal, so that we have private IP address on the inside, public IP address on the outside, and you can talk back and forth. When you get into a real SASE vendor, that SASE vendor is going to give you the ability to put an appliance on your network. That appliance is going to provide the SD-WAN function. That appliance is going to build the tunnels to their service, and they're going to give you the firewall as a service. They're going to give you the firewall functionality in their cloud, right? Basically, AKA they've got servers and data centers that you're connecting to. So their appliance is building tunnels to their data centers. Their data centers run all the functions in those things. What's awesome about this infrastructure, and as you build this out, is now you get into a situation where you've got stable SD-WAN, stable path and circuit selection, with a very simplistic architecture and infrastructure at your edges, at your network locations, at your offices, at your warehouses, at your data center, whatever you want to call it. And all it needs to do is it needs to connect to the internet, provide a VPN tunnel, and do circuit selection. So there's not a lot going on there. It doesn't have to have a huge processor. It's not trying to do deep packet inspection or threat management or all these different things at UTM that these firewall vendors are going to try to sell you. And all that function exists within the service provider's infrastructure and cloud. And so when they apply updates and when they see stuff, they apply updates to everybody at the same time. So if you've ever had and tried to do an update, software update, because you've had a critical vulnerability from, we can pick on everybody. They all have them. Palo Alto has one. Fortinet had Barracuda. They've all had these, Cisco, they all have them. If you've got one firewall or you've got a pair of firewalls, maybe that's easy for you to schedule a maintenance window in the middle of the night and do a firmware update as soon as it's available. That's the other key. It may type that manufacturer to make it available and push that update out. If you've got 100 locations, 500 locations, 1,000 locations, now all of a sudden you're talking about you're going to have 2,000 devices that you have to update. That's not something you do in one night. Great thing about SASE and SSE in those situations is the service provider is maintaining that update on their core infrastructure, and the whole thing uplifts at the same time. So much faster response time to events and security issues and networks and people doing nefarious things. Other thing that's amazing about SASE is I talked about how you have an appliance that goes for your SD-WAN function at your office. Well, your remote users, here's the fun part. Your remote users are the agent that's going to run on their devices is connecting the same infrastructure. Now, it doesn't have to be the same data center. I mean, if you're looking at old antiquated service providers and usually ISPs, telcos, they're trying to sell you like big iron firewalls, usually based on Fortinets. If you're on the West Coast of the United States, they're going to give you a primary firewall instance on the West Coast of the United States. But then if you fly to New York to go have meetings with your investment bankers because you want to go public, and your CEO's laptop and cell phone has to build a tunnel back to the West Coast and then go to the internet from there, your CEO is going to be pissed off at you, right? Not a good position. It's even worse if they're on vacation in Spain, right? Because now it's going from Spain all the way back to the West Coast. With the SASE vendor, what ends up happening is that device connects to the POP that's closest to it. And that POP that's close to it has connections to the POPs closest to the other side of it, right? And you still get the ability to apply the same policy depending on where your users are. So it makes no difference. Your user could be on the West Coast, they could go to a Starbucks, they could go home, they could go to a library, they could travel to the East Coast, they could travel to Europe, they could go to Asia, whatever it is. And you still have a unified policy and controls that go across everything. And you have the ability to also build private connections between your endpoints as necessary for your applications. This is also awesome when you start talking about an application, CASB. So most people are implementing this like CASB light, but what is basic? What's a good example? Salesforce. You have Salesforce. You have Office 365. You have Slack. You have whatever you're running. You can actually go to that software. You can go to that SaaS vendor, and you can say only allow connections to my instance from this IP range or from this authentication, for instance. I mean, you can get pretty deep depending on what that SaaS vendor supports. And you can effectively create a firewall in front of a public internet service. So, I mean, if you've ever used Salesforce, you go to salesforce.com, right? You sign in. Well, now imagine in order to sign into your infrastructure inside of Salesforce, it has to come from your authenticated SASE vendor, right? In order to log into it. Otherwise, you just say, hey, you can't access this. So these things layer on protection for you in terms of like, even if you had a password disclosure and your CFO's NetSuite username and password leaked out, somebody couldn't log into it because they have to get behind your CASB in order to authenticate and connect to it, right? So these are all things. The problem with SD-WAN and SSE and SASE is the marketing departments at these vendors, because when each time that Gartner or Forrester or somebody creates a new terminology, a new standard, then everybody wants to just swim downstream, right? Follow the current and check into it. I'm going to pick on Cisco Meraki right now. Now, Meraki, Cisco bought, so it's not necessarily they didn't create this, but Cisco Meraki will tell you that they have an SD-WAN support in their environment. Sure, by the loosest definition of SD-WAN, it's a cloud configured web interface to manage it, and you can do point and click VPN configuration between your MX firewalls. Okay. Sure, it does. That's SD-WAN. What it doesn't do is performance-based path selection and circuit failover for you. It does an IP monitoring with an SLA timeout. So unless the default profile on a Meraki is a 5-minute failover between two network circuits. It's not going to tell you circuit A is faster than circuit B. Use circuit A, or circuit A is saturated. Stop using it. It is extremely primitive, and they sell it in SD-WAN, and it freaking sucks, because it's not what you want. Fortinet, really popular SD-WAN, way more functionality built into it. Confusing to configure if you haven't done it before, but will do path selection, will be application aware, has the problems of only being one half of the network equation, right? It doesn't have the other side of the network equation in order to actually give you real QoS and IP survivability. Of course, I already mentioned people that are pushing into and trying to sell a SASE solution that aren't actually SASE vendors. What's another one? Palo Alto. Palo Alto bought CloudGenix. CloudGenix had just a really cool SD-WAN box in some cases. The CloudGenix software would actually look at all the way down to the TCP session establishing, and what was the SYN and ACK, and are there resets being served, and what was actually going on in the application. So if you had a lingering application on one circuit, it would be aware of that and actually fail it over to a second circuit for you. So you have very sophisticated circuit failover. Now the problem with the CloudGenix environment was if you wanted any sort of inbound protected failover. Again, some people have services that they have to run that they have to go inbound. The CloudGenix required you to put appliances into a data center behind a BGP network. So, you still had this other layer of routers and then the evils of BGP that you had to deal with, and they didn't really ever create an answer for this. But now if you were just talking about edge locations, and you could pair the CloudGenix SD-WAN with an SSE vendor like a Zscaler, it did some really amazing things for you. And there's a great quote. It was basically time to innocence for network teams of like, oh no, it's not us. It's Salesforce is having a problem. You know, our network is fine and I can prove it that it's Salesforce. We have to wait for Salesforce to fix itself. I really like that. Anyways, Palo Alto, when they purchasing CloudGenix and using CloudGenix as a foundation for Palo's now SD-WAN, wants you to push you into an arc. Even with Prisma, if you have somebody sit down and diagram out what a Prisma access network architecture looks for you, you know, basically what you end up with is it's like, oh, you know, like we're going to need a firewall. And then behind that, we're going to put our SD-WAN. We're either going to put that there, or maybe we're going to put it over here to the side, because you could put the CloudGenix SD-WAN, you could put outside the firewall, inside the firewall. So I'll just kind of draw those both there. I'll just kind of go like that. But anyways, and then you're going to connect this to the internet, and then you're going to have a remote user over here. And oh, by the way, you also have to have your data center. Here's your data center. I'm going to put lots of boxes. And your data center has to have a BGP connection with two networks. So we have two lines coming into your data center. Here's your two routers. And then here's all the CloudGenix boxes in the data center. And by the way, you still need your big Palo Alto firewalls. And then now we've got this other thing that we call Prisma. And so selectively on the internet, we're going to create these Prisma gateways. And your remote user can connect to a Prisma gateway, which then can connect to here, which then can come through the router and through this SD-WAN box and to the firewall, and then terminate on this firewall and then come back. And you start going through these network architectures and you're like, who in their right mind would want to do this? Mainly because you probably already have Palo Alto infrastructure and you have to because you can't throw it all out. But here's the difference. If you were greenfielding a SASE solution, and by the way, if you can, this is what you should do. You have an office location, you have redundant SD-WAN boxes. Here's your SD-WAN appliance provided by the SASE vendor. And by the way, this plugs inside into your switches because you have everything redundant. We're going to do this kind of thing. And you've got your two internet connections. You know, really this is just the internet, right? Well, this is what this looks like with your remote users. Right? And if you had another location, maybe it doesn't have high availability, but it's just a single site SD-WAN with a bunch of users behind it, right? Way less for you to manage or think about. It's take the leap. Just do it. Or, you know, maybe, you know, the situation you're in, you need a, you know, baby step and you're going to do, you know, have an existing SD-WAN and you're going to go into an SSE environment and overlay on top of that. That's fine too. You know, I'm going to share a dirty secret. I'm going to get a great note from my people here about this stream of light coming right through that corner of that shade, hitting me on the thing. So anyways, the secret is most of what I do and what my team does, and when we're talking to enterprises and talking to people, it's like, what problem are you trying to solve? First and foremost, right? Are you solving an optimization problem, a performance problem, a QS problem, a failover problem, a saturation problem, a security problem? Like, what problem are you trying to solve, right? How big is that problem? What are you trying to solve? What's the impact to your business? You know, these kind of things. What do you already have, right? So there's like, first is problem, second is what do you already have? Because a lot of times what you already have is going to force you into directions. I mean, if there's 30 vendors in the market roughly offering what you want, and you already are running something, that might cut your selection list from like 30 vendors to 5 vendors without even like spending any time. Like, don't spend weeks and months doing RFPs and RFIs with people if you can down select 95% of the suppliers in the market based on something that you already have and running and knowing. Like, that should be, so we spend most of our time actually there. It's just, it becomes a really easy process once you identify what it is, but understanding how to make that decision and what's actually critical, right? So then it's like, what problem do you have? What are you trying to solve? And then of course, you know, who's going to give you good pricing, who's not dysfunctional, who actually has a roadmap, who has support, who has, you know, good service. I mean, that kind of like the third leg of that stool there. But chances are you're already in this thing. You already have something and you need to put something else on top of it. So it's, what does that roadmap look like and how do you take baby steps between point A and point B? If you have questions, comment below, send me an email. I'm happy to share, you know, and get into specifics with you on your case, right? Because it's almost impossible to give generic information with this, because it's so much of it is like, it depends, it depends. But I'm very happy to help you through this process and figuring out like what the heck is going on and how to make your life better. I mean, ultimately, right? Like, how to make your life better and make this stuff make sense and be easier to manage. And I say that, you know, coming from a background of doing network engineering and dealing with the most spaghetti monster networks you can imagine and trying to, improve them and maintain them and deal with corporate bureaucracy nonsense. Anyways, questions or comments, comment below. I'm Max Clark. This was a 2-part rant on SD-WAN, SSE, and SASE, and I hope it helps you.
Feel it.